It's my great privilege and pleasure now to introduce NACADA's President Jayne Drake, who will be serving as our event moderator today. In addition to her long history of providing leadership and service to our association, Jayne is the Vice Dean for Academic Affairs at Temple University. So I will turn us over to Jayne now, and we will begin.
Oh, well, thank you, Lee, and hello, everyone. On your screen, you should see photos of all of today's panelists, and I'll be introducing each of them as we go along. Maura Reynolds, who is a professor of Latin at Hope College in Holland, Michigan, and who currently serves as the chair of NACADA's Publications Advisory Board, is going to start us off and lay a foundation for the approaches that the remaining panelists will present. So, Maura, begin with the groundwork.
Thanks, Jayne. As NACADA's concept of academic advising reminds us, academic advising is a series of intentional interactions. In other words, advising is something we have to organize and be deliberate about. Good advising can't be left to chance. There are many ways to organize advising, and in a few minutes you'll hear from the advisors whose pictures you just saw. Each uses different approaches to organize their advising efforts. But what unites all their approaches is that each approach is learning-centered. Lots of research has been done about how people learn. I'm not a psychologist, but because I teach and advise, I enjoy reading about how people learn, and understanding just a little bit about what learning involves has, I hope, improved my teaching and my advising. One of my favorite articles about learning comes from 1993. It's a very readable short piece by Tom Angelo called A Teacher's Dozen. Angelo's article explores 14 principles he considers important for improving learning in the classroom. 6 of Angelo's principles for improving learning in the classroom seem equally important for improving learning in the advising office. So let's take a quick look at these 6 principles adapted just a bit for advising. Learning Principle 1. Active learning is more effective than passive learning. Seems pretty obvious. When we actively involve our advisees, their learning will be more effective. No matter where or who we advise, we can find ways to involve our advisees. We can, for example, ask them to write responses to questions like, what are your goals for the term? Or how has your education changed you? We also involve our advisees actively. We ask them to visit a website or another office and report about what they learned. Each of these strategies expects students to do something and be actively involved in advising. Our panelists will offer other ways to adapt this principle because active learning is more effective than passive learning. Learning 2. Learning is more efficient when advisees have explicit, reasonable, positive goals and when their goals fit well with the advisor's goals. Whether we use a formal advising syllabus or something less formal, this second principle emphasizes the importance of communicating the purposes of advising. And as those of us who teach in the classroom know, telling once isn't enough, nor is it sufficient simply to list goals in a syllabus. Instead, we remind advisees often and explicitly to connect our advising practices to our learning goals for advising. We know that most assume that the goal of advising is class scheduling or registration. So if we believe in a rich, broader scope, we need to communicate our goals so we can help all to see the importance and relevance of advising. We'll need to adapt goals for individual students. A learning goal for full-time traditional aid students may not be appropriate for mature students who are attending a 2-year college part-time while working and handling family responsibilities. Learning Principle number 3. High expectations encourage high achievement. No one ever rises to meet low expectations. If we believe in the power of learning-centered advising, we'll expect students to take advantage of it. Again, we'll need to tailor our expectations for each advisee, but our expectations should demand that each advisee stretches to meet the goal. The mantra of challenge and support rings true for teaching in the classroom and teaching in the advising office. So we'll probably find that those who are new to college or those with weaker preparation may need more support than those with stronger backgrounds or more experience in college. Learning principle number 4. Motivation is alterable. It can be positively or negatively affected by the task, the environment, the advisor, and the advisee. I like this principle because it reminds me that people are more motivated to learn when they understand the value of what they're learning. Our job is to communicate that value and to communicate it often in words and in actions. The more we can connect advising with the real world, the more our advisees may recognize its value. Every day we work with students to enhance skills of reflection, self-assessment, goal setting, and decision-making. Valuable skills our advisees will use throughout their lives in the real world. While this may seem obvious to us, experience suggests that it may not be so obvious to students. Learning principle number 5. To learn well, advisees need feedback early and often, and to become independent, they need to learn how to give themselves feedback. This 5th principle builds on the first, that active learning is more effective than passive learning. When I talked about that principle, I suggested we could apply it, asking questions like, what are your goals for the term? If we keep written responses to these advising questions on file or in an electronic archive, we'll find lots of opportunities to follow up and offer feedback. Sometimes that feedback may mean a pat on the back and the encouragement to keep on, and sometimes it may mean quite the opposite. If we ask advisees at the end of the year to look at the goals they set at the beginning and to assess how well they achieved their goals, and then to set some goals for the upcoming year, the result can be a powerful exercise in reflection and self-assessment. And learning principle number 6. Interaction between advisees and advisors is one of the most powerful factors in promoting learning, and interaction among advisees is another. Our advising meetings with students matter. As George Koo writes, it's hard to imagine any academic support function more important to student success and institutional productivity than advising. With this idea in mind, we'll want to make the most of every advising meeting. The second part of this principle reminds us that other students can play an important role in fostering learning-centered advising. For example, a group meeting involving a particular major can help newer students understand what lies ahead and help them learn from more experienced students, and it can also help the experienced students reflect on their academic and personal paths. These 6 learning principles have helped me focus more deliberately on learning as I meet with my advisees, but I don't want to suggest that these principles have to be adopted by all of us. Instead, I hope each of us will reflect and ask some questions. What learning principles guide my advising practices? What's my list of principles? And how do my principles and my practices enhance the learning of my advisees? We work in environments with diverse students. These 6 general learning principles won't mean much until we can apply them to our own particular circumstances and to the people we're privileged to work with every day. Now let's explore the rich variety of ways we can apply learning principles to our advising practices. Jayne, back to you.
Thank you, Maura. We're going to begin with the self-authorship approach, so I would like to introduce our 2 panelists who use that technique. Janet Schulenberg is an academic advisor at Penn State's Division of Undergraduate Studies and is coordinator of the academic content of the first-year testing, consulting, and advising program, which is Penn State's longstanding academic orientation program. Her 2009 NACADA presentation on this topic was entitled Encouraging Self-Authorship Through Academic Advising. And Carrie Kincannon is head advisor for the University Exploratory Studies Program, which is the academic home for undecided exploratory students at Oregon State University. Carrie has presented at numerous regional and annual conferences on a range of topics, and he's the author of the NACADA Clearinghouse overview on this topic. And I believe Janet is going to get us started.
Thanks, Jane, and hello, everybody. The learner-centered concepts, theories, and strategies on today's agenda all share a learning outcome: to help students position themselves as educated adults who can contribute to and interact with a complex society in meaningful ways. The topic that Carrie and I will discuss with you today is firmly entrenched in this goal. We are to explore how the theory of self-authorship has entered the discourse of academic advising and how it can translate into practice. Carrie's going to start talking about it for us.
Thanks, John. Hi, everyone. Self-authorship was first introduced as a psychological concept by Robert Kegan in the late 1980s to negotiate what Kegan calls the mental demands of modern life. An individual must self-author by moving past being defined by external forces and developing the capacity to make meaning by internally defining beliefs, values, and relationships. This concept of self-authorship has been further explored and explained by Maura Baxter-Magolda through a longitudinal study focused on college students as they enter adulthood. Baxter-Magolda observed that young adults shift from uncritical acceptance of external authority to critical analysis grounded in internal authority as they develop more complex ways of learning. Baxter-Magolda defines self-authorship as the internal capacity to define one's beliefs, identity, and social relations. A self-authored individual will have increased his or her ability to function autonomously, developed healthy relationships with others, dealt with his or her identity, and defined his or her purpose. Baxter-Magolda's extensive longitudinal study of college students led her to posit a theory of an intellectual development that combines three dimensions: the cognitive, which is how one comes to know something; the interpersonal, which is how one defines oneself; and the intrapersonal, which is how one relates to others. In general, theorists studying this developmental process identified three stages that lead to a self-authored state. The first stage of self-authorship is following external formulas. Individuals in this stage generally rely on uncritical assimilation of beliefs and values from external sources to define their own beliefs and values. This way of making decisions is rooted in the belief that knowledge is absolute and held by authorities. Most students of traditional age enter college in this developmental state, and it impacts their learning and decision-making in college. For example, individuals in this state tend to learn through memorization and act in relationships to acquire approval. Students in this state, for example, may make decisions about majors or careers based on what others, especially family members, have told them they should do. At some point, many individuals moved into the crossroads, or a period of questioning. Individuals may be thrust into the crossroads when they encounter complex problems of work and life, and external formulas no longer work to solve those problems. Individuals in the crossroads begin to realize the dilemmas of external self-definition and begin to grapple with internal identity. Persistent or significant experiences of disequilibrium are critical triggers for a student to enter the crossroads and engage in the internal reflection needed to move beyond this stage. If a person successfully engages with the disequilibrium of the crossroads, he or she moves into a state of authoring one's own life. This is a stage of clarifying, where a person has grappled with the dilemmas of following external formulas and is actively negotiating his or her internal definition of self in the context of other relationships. Although these stages reflect increasing sophistication in decision-making, they are not necessarily followed by an individual in lockstep order, and individuals often loop around these stages. When an individual consistently engages in contextually appropriate meaning-making, he or she is considered self-authored. Janet?
Baxter-McGold's research resulted in two key conclusions regarding self-authorship in higher education. The first is that despite the fact that self-authorship encompasses many of the educational goals of higher education, traditional age students barely even get to the crossroads while in college. The second is that college educators are positioned to encourage, promote, and facilitate self-authorship in graduate students. Recently, Baxter-McGold, Jane Pizzolato, and others have actively encouraged the application of self-authorship theory to academic advising, particularly through pedagogy Baxter-McGold calls the Learning Partnerships Model. The Learning Partnerships Model has three principles for promoting development of self-authorship in students through educational practice that is applicable to academic advising. The first principle is to validate the student as a knower, as one who can create knowledge. Second is to situate learning within the student's experience. The third principle is to define learning as a mutually constructed activity. Organizing educational transactions around these three principles creates conditions that encourage students to engage the developmental process and to become interdependent thinkers. Jane Pizzolato has written for the NACADA Journal and elsewhere about how the Learning Partnership Model can offer strategies to help advisors achieve outcomes articulated by the Council for the Advancement of Standards in Higher Education, which NACADA Executive Director Charlie Nutt and past President Eric White discussed in a webinar broadcast this past December. Discuss advising methods that provoke students to move away from external definition and toward self-authorship. Baxter-McGold and Patricia King recently published an article advocating for the unique position that advisors have as educators who can encourage students to be active agents in authoring their own cognitive, intrapersonal, and interpersonal identity through the Learning Partnerships Model. Pizzolato, Baxter-McGold, and King share scenarios and student stories in their texts to illustrate self-authorship theory and application of learning partnerships principles. These examples are the stuff of developmental advising and are very familiar to advisors. We encourage you to consult these resources to get a more robust framework for understanding self-authorship, but we want to share key issues of the theory that translate into advising practice. Advising for self-authorship is a process that is reflective. Baxter-McGold and King discuss the centrality of reflection to the Learning Partnership Model and point to the kind of open-ended questioning that already characterizes good advising practice. Advisors have the opportunity to offer questions and comments that encourage students to deepen their reflection, while at the same time validating the student as a knower and situating learning within the student's own experience. Challenging students to reflect on how and why they came to a particular decision about their education is one way we can encourage students to move toward more complex ways of thinking. We apply this principle in our academic orientation at Penn State in a number of ways. First, we guide each new first-year student to research his or her intended major prior to attending orientation. Our planning homework sheet, which you see on your slide, is included in your handout as well. At orientation, we ask students to articulate how their goals relate to the goals of their families, the university, and society. We've also included a goal setting worksheet for you in your materials. At orientation, advisors have a one-on-one conversation with each student about their academic plans. In these conversations, students are asked to describe how and why they made their decisions so far, and advisors have the opportunity to challenge students to articulate internally defined rationales for their decisions. Carrie, what can you tell us about advising for self-authorship as an active process?
Janet, Carrie's lost his connection. We may need to have you just continue on.
Okay, no problem. So advising for self-authorship is an active learning process. Its outcome is a student with the ability to reflect critically upon the world and make their own meaning from it. The advisor facilitates this by validating students' capacity to learn, offering avenues for learning and experience, and positioning the student to be the one who takes action. Classroom active learning exercises like minute papers, pro-con lists, or role-playing can easily be utilized in the advising appointment. When Carrie meets with students at Orphade's Exploratory Studies program, he tries to incorporate writing as an active exercise to help students contextualize their learning. He prompts students prior to their appointment to reflect upon their experiences as they relate to the exploration and decision-making processes. This comes in the form of an intake sheet, which you should see on your screen and is included in a handout, where Carrie asks a series of reflective questions. An example might be, discuss 2 specific actions you've taken since the start of the year to make progress in deciding on your major. What did you learn from these experiences? Rarely does an appointment culminate without there being action items and next steps. Carrie keeps a stack of 4x6 note cards on his desk and frequently asks students to use one to create a to-do list that asks what is next for them in their exploration process. Advising for self-authorship is also provocative. In order for a student to self-author, the student needs to experience a disequilibrium, a significant discomfort with his or her current way of solving problems. It is the discomfort of the disequilibrium that inspires reflection, exploration, and evaluation. Sometimes the advisor must be the provocateur, the one who challenges the student to face complexity and shines the spotlight on the disequilibrium as a means to inspire forward movement. If we solve our students' problems for them, or satisfy a student's presented problem without pointing out the other underlying problems, then we've missed a chance to provoke a student's development. For example, I recently met with a student who has been persistently targeting a science major, but has earned failing grades in fundamental science courses and needs a signature to continue his enrollment. I could just sign his form and send him on his way down the same path he's been on, or I could draw on self-authorship theory and point out the pattern to his grades and challenge him to consider his larger goal, research alternative academic paths. Self-authorship is a collaborative process. The exchange of ideas and the consideration of multiple perspectives are imperative for students as they develop skills for contextually appropriate meaning-making. Student needs what Robin calls good company, the people and an environment that supports the rigors of the journey. It's also important that students develop the capacity to work interdependently with others to problem solve and to be able to contextualize their own understanding. Advising influenced by the learning partnership model is deliberate and process-oriented. Carey mandates that his students meet with him face-to-face at least once a term. He talks about that in-person contact as necessary to their unique process. Carey monitors the arc of the learning partnership and gauges whether students are developing the interdependent capability to take on the question at hand. For example, if answering that question involves web research to gather information, Carey wants to measure that capacity to handle the task. He might say something like, let's do research on that, you drive. And then he transfers his computer keyboard and wireless mouse to the other side of the desk and lets the student initiate the action. As you've probably gathered by now, self-authorship theory has many layers and suggests many possibilities for academic advising, more than we could hope to cover in our short time with you today. We invite you to dive into the work scholars we referenced today and to consult the supplemental materials we've provided. Thanks for listening. Carrie and I will be happy to answer any questions you might have at the end of the presentation or by email after the broadcast. Jane, back to you.
Thank you both, Carrie and Janet. I hope everyone can hear me all right since I seem to have some microphone connections, and I'm assuming that you are. So next we will hear from Rob Pette, who will discuss the technique of motivational interviewing. Rob is the advising coordinator for the Department of Kinesiology at Kansas State University, and in this role, he is the primary advisor for the 400-plus undergraduates pursuing a degree in kinesiology. He has written and presented at the state, regional, and national level on this topic, including his session, Motivational Interviewing and Advising, Working with Students to Change. This was presented at the 2008 NACADA Annual Conference in Chicago, and he's also done an article for NACADA's Academic Advising Today. So, Rob?
Well, thank you, Jane, and hello, everyone. As Jane mentioned, I advise undergraduates pursuing a degree in kinesiology. I work with students in structuring schedules, but also work with students facing academic probation and dismissal. Today, I'd like to discuss potential uses of motivational interviewing in the advising area. There's a metaphor called an autobiography in 5 chapters. Chapter 1 is I walk down the street. There's a deep hole in the sidewalk. I fall in. I am lost. I am helpless. It isn't my fault. It takes forever to find a way out. Chapter 2. I walk down the same street. There's a deep hole in the sidewalk. I pretend I don't see it. I fall in again. I can't believe I'm in the same place, but it isn't my fault. It still takes a long time to get out. Chapter 3. I walk down the same street. There's a deep hole in the sidewalk. I see it is there. I fall in. It is a habit. But my eyes are open. I know where I am. It is my fault. I get out immediately. Chapter 4. I walk down the same street. There's a deep hole in the sidewalk. I walk around it. Chapter 5. I walk down a different street. As we talk about motivational interviewing, we're really talking about change. But we're talking about change that is self-directed by the advisee. This is not prescriptive advising approach of telling the advisee what to do. Motivational interviewing is more related to the developmental advising approach. Motivational interviewing is a technique that is designed to move the advisee from ambivalence about change to arguing for change. The implicit theory behind motivational interviewing is the more a client defends the status quo, the less likely behavior change. But the more the client argues for change, the more likely behavior change will occur. Motivational interviewing is defined as a directive, client-centered counseling style for eliciting behavior change by helping clients explore and resolve ambivalence. Motivational interviewing has traditionally been used in the management of diseases associated with behavior such as alcohol abuse, drug addiction, smoking, weight loss, and the reason I became interested in this technique, physical activity. When we think about behavior change, one theory that's been developed and tested is the trans-theoretical stage of change model. Developed by DiClemente and Prochaska, this model was used to explain the process of smoking cessation. In this model, an individual goes through 5 stages as they change a behavior. In the pre-contemplation stage, the individual is not even considering change. In the second stage, contemplation, they acknowledge the possibility of the need for change. In the third stage, known as preparation, they're making a decision to change within the next month. The fourth stage is action, when change is implemented, and the final stage is maintenance, where the individual is comfortable with change and has maintained change for a period of 6 months. This change is viewed as a progression, where through some behavioral or experiential process, the individual begins to implement and maintain a different behavior. When working with students who are on academic probation or are coming back from academic dismissal, a natural tendency is to want to give the student a list of behaviors they need to change to make things different the next time. The challenge is that these students need to be motivated to make these changes for future outcomes to be different. I'm not sure that there's that many students out there who want to be dismissed or on probation. Most would like things to be different, but may not be sure how or if they can make the needed changes. This is where motivational interviewing can be utilized to help the students initiate and act on the changes to be made. So the question becomes, when do we make changes? Quite often we make changes when we're dissatisfied with our current state. Miller and Rolnick talk about how the client must be ready, able, and willing. Is change a priority? Is the individual confident in their ability to change? And does the individual recognize the importance of change? One technique to utilize is to have the student examine the discrepancy between where they currently are and where they would like to be. The use of change rulers involves exploring both how important is change to the advisee and how confident they feel about making those changes. 2 questions that can be utilized are, on a scale of 0 to 10, how important is it for you to change the target behavior, such as getting off academic probation, where 0 is not at all important and 10 is extremely important? The second question is, how confident would you say you are that if you decided to change the target behavior, you could do it, where 0 is not at all confident and 10 is extremely confident. These items can be followed up by exploring the discrepancy between what they're doing and what they would like to be doing, and also discussing the issue of confidence for change to occur. When looking at the technique of motivational interviewing, one issue is that this technique requires the advisee to engage and discuss change. The advisor must facilitate this discussion, but is working in unison with the advisee. The 4 general principles of motivational interviewing are expressing empathy, developing discrepancy, rolling with resistance, and supporting self-efficacy. One of the greatest challenges is allowing the advisee to direct the change. The advisor needs to offer more reflections than questions and needs to ask open-ended questions that stimulate the advisee to think about current behaviors and the need for change. Miller and Rolnick give numerous examples of open questions that can evoke change talk in 4 areas: disadvantages of the status quo, advantages of change, optimism for change, and intention to change. Active listening and the strategic use of questioning can enhance the likelihood of the advisee developing and acting on change strategies. I found motivational interviewing to be a useful technique both in physical activity counseling and advising, but there are some considerations involved. One issue that always rears its ugly head is time. Students on probation or academic reinstatement are required to work with their advisor throughout the semester. Having numerous sessions allows time to explore the behaviors that put the student in their current situation and the chance to explore changes that can be made. Another issue is the type of change the student determines necessary to make may be too little change to alleviate the problem. But it is also possible to view any change that is productive as beneficial for the student long term. Motivational interviewing is not a magic wand to solve student problems. Some students respond better to the technique than others. Some students want a list of things to do, and in some cases where the motivation is already present, this can lead to change. Other students need to build that motivation for change, and motivational interviewing is a technique that can assist in this process. Dr. Judy Huey and I are currently conducting a research project funded by NACADA to examine how the use of motivational interviewing affects the academic self-efficacy, persistence, and health behaviors in students on academic reinstatement, with the goal of testing this technique in the academic arena. Back to you, Jane.
Well, thank you, Rob. Next, we'll hear from Jennifer Varney, who will discuss the Intrusive advising approach. Jennifer Varney is the Director of Graduate Advising at Southern New Hampshire University Online. She's been working with non-traditional students for the past 10 years and is also an adjunct instructor in the graduate school at SNHU. In addition to her many presentations at NACADA conferences, Jen has written on this topic for Academic Advising Today. She currently serves our membership as the chair of the Advising Adult Learners Commission. So, Jen?
Thanks, Jane. My position is somewhat unique among today's panelists because I am the Director of Advising for non-traditional graduate students at SNHU. Our students take classes either online or in the classroom and are from all over the world. I'd also like to mention that before I came to SNHU, I was advising a highly at-risk population at a local for-profit institution. Most of those students were working on 2-year degrees, and many of them were first-generation college students. This is when I discovered intrusive advising and its benefits, particularly with this population. Intrusive advising, which was defined by the work of Robert Glennon, is an advising theory in which the advisor intentionally makes contact with students. The point of this contact is to get to the heart of what might be causing or could potentially cause the student difficulty and work through these issues before they become significant problems. The proactive nature of intrusive advising allows the advisor to make contact with the student before the student reaches out to the advisor, which really demonstrates that the advisor knows the student and is concerned for his or her welfare. Intrusive advising also has been linked to facilitating informed and responsible decision-making in students as they are able to work through situations before they reach critical mass. Intrusive advising tends to work particularly well with at-risk students. Because so many of them are first-generation college students, they likely are not versed on navigating the college support system and need advisor help and guidance to be a successful student. All students need to know that someone at the institution cares for them, but this is particularly true with at-risk students. And by providing students with a single point of contact or face of the institution, the advisor helps the student to advocate for him or herself. There are many ways to practice intrusive advising. One place to start is to determine intentional points of contact with students that make sense and are easy to track. Some of the examples of this include the student first term, when grades become available, registration, events and activities on campus, special interest, or any other way to segment your population that offers an opportunity to do some student outreach. This outreach can be done by phone, by email, IM, face-to-face. You find out how your students communicate with each other and plug into that network. In our office, we intrusive advising principles with our students every day. We have developed a communication calendar to guide our outreach efforts and ensure that all advisors are proactively outreaching the designated student segment at the appropriate time. Examples of outreach scheduled on our calendar include the opening of registration, deadlines for certain forms to be filed, new student check-ins, and we actually give a great deal of focus to our first, second, and third students, as we have found that they are typically the most at risk. As an online advisor, I have several students for whom English is not their first language, and many have not attended school in the United States previously. These students need outreach not only for programmatic decisions, but also for the mechanics of being a student, for example, like writing a paper in APA format. When I worked with students in the face-to-face format, I also made daily use of the principles of intrusive advising. I made sure that I knew where students gathered on campus and made it a point to spend time there interacting with them. This involved the hallways, the break room, the smoking area, wherever I knew students would be. That's where you could find me. I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have about how I use this technique with my advisees. Jane?
Well, thank you, Jennifer. And next we'll hear from Laurie Schreiner, who will discuss the strengths-based advising approach. Laurie is professor and chair of doctoral higher education at Azusa Pacific University. Laurie is co-author of Strengths Quest, Discover and Develop Your Strengths in Academic Advising, Here and Beyond. And her institution is home to the only strengths-based PhD in higher education in the United States. Laurie has presented a number of concurrent and pre-conference workshops on strengths-based advising at the NACADA annual conferences over the years. Laurie?
Thanks, Jane. I appreciate the opportunity to highlight strengths-based advising as an approach to help our students get the most out of their college experience. The basic concept behind strengths-based advising is to encourage our students to pattern their behaviors and choices after high achievers, to do what high achievers do. That's going to be the key to their success. If you want to know what produces excellence, you study the best of the best, people who are excellent. And that's what researchers have done in creating strengths development programs. They've studied high-achieving college students. And one thing they've noticed that high achievers do, besides study, is that they spend most of their time in their areas of strength, and they've learned to apply those strengths to the challenges they face. The strengths development approach is built on this idea that students are able to reach their optimal level of functioning when they build on their talents, more so than if they spend the same amount of time and effort trying to improve their areas of weakness. Spending time on my weaknesses can help me improve, perhaps even to a level of average, but it rarely will produce excellence. And the bigger problem is that it doesn't motivate or energize me. And that's our biggest challenge as educators, how to motivate our students to engage in the learning process. So what do we mean by a strength? A strength is the ability to do something consistently well, and it occurs when our natural talents and energy are multiplied by the knowledge and skills that we gain from the environments around us. But it all starts with talent, those thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that occur naturally within us and can be productively applied. They can be ways of processing information or interacting with people or seeing the world, habits, behaviors, beliefs, anything that leads us to be more effective. And these are natural reactions, those 2-second intuitive responses to situations that occur almost without conscious thought. For instance, some of us enter a room full of strangers, and we are energized by all the friends we haven't met yet, so we begin working the room. Others of us enter that same room and notice those on the margins, people who are feeling left out, so we begin to seek them out and include them in our conversations. And still others of us notice our VP in the room and immediately begin to strategize about the conversation we might have with her while she is in a good mood. All of those 2-second reactions are manifestations of talent. Now, we can identify these talents in our advisees either through questions we ask in the advising sessions or by using instruments that are developed specifically for this purpose. On the slide in front of you, you can see some examples of questions we might ask our students to tap into their existing talents that they bring into the college environment. And you'll find a more extensive list in the event handout. I particularly like the last question on this slide. I asked students to tell me about a time when they accomplished something they were proud of. It doesn't have to be academic. It could be something like building a treehouse in 6th grade or organizing a bake sale for church. But by hearing their stories of success, I begin to see their talents, the arranging and organizing skills, the persuasive ability, or the leadership to get lots of people to work together on a project. And although there are lots of good questions we can ask our advisees to determine their talents, there's also a quicker way of identifying talent in our students. One of those ways is through the Clifton Strengths Finder. That's an example of an instrument that can jumpstart our conversations about talent. This instrument, which is available from the Gallup organization, is an online inventory that was developed after interviewing over 2 million highly successful people across the world in hundreds of different occupations. Students spend about 30 minutes answering questions online and then receive a profile of their top 5 signature talent themes, those areas where their greatest talents lie. There are 34 of these possible themes, and all of us have talents in all 34. But the instrument identifies the 5 areas of our greatest talent so that we can begin to productively apply those areas to the challenges we face. Now, this isn't the only instrument out there. You will hear about some other instruments a little bit later that are available, but the key is to begin to have these conversations with our students to identify the talent. But you see, that's just the beginning. The talent is that predisposition that can produce a strength when it gets developed by investing time and effort to gain the knowledge and practice the skills that are needed to be excellent on a consistent basis. So as you can see on this diagram, investment has a multiplier effect on the talent to produce a strength. Now, as I've already mentioned, in your resource materials, you have a list of questions that can be asked of students at each step of the advising process. And so on this slide, you see the 5 steps that I'm going to briefly talk about in the following slides. And these steps are simply to help you put some concrete handles on this process. The far more important issue is that this is a perspective and an approach to working with students. But the first step is to really identify the talents and strengths our students bring with them to the college environment. When we look at high achievers, we find that they're often very aware not only of their talents, but of the environments where their talents can flourish. So at this stage of the advising process, we might ask questions of our students, such as the ones listed earlier, to identify their talents, or we might help them access instruments to do that, but we also ask them to think about what brings out your best, what helps you thrive. The next step is to help students become more aware of their strengths by affirming them with others who know them and love them. Hearing stories from their parents about where they've seen their son or daughter's talents in action can be incredibly affirming to students, as can talking with their friends or roommates or siblings or significant others who can give them examples of where they've noticed them applying their talents to be successful. Another way to approach this step is by asking students about their previous successes and then talking with them about how they used particular talents or strengths to be successful in those situations. Step 3 is an envisioning process. helping students think about the possible selves that exist in their future, what they want to become, and where they see themselves after graduation. Now, if thinking that far ahead is too big for some students, asking them to think about what they want out of their college experience this semester can be helpful. This is not necessarily about career planning or selection. It's about who you want to become, what kind of person, living what kind of life. And my favorite question to ask in this step is the first one you see on this slide. If you didn't have to worry about money and knew you couldn't fail, what would you love to do? This question often taps into the dreams that can really energize and motivate a student. The next step builds on this one. After students have envisioned a future self, then our task is to help them create an action plan, or what I call a personal success plan for getting there. What do they need to do this semester, or even this week, in order to reach their goals? It's helpful here to not just talk about academic or vocational goals, but also to discuss interpersonal goals, such as physical or spiritual goals. And by spiritual goals, I mean things that get at their sense of meaning and purpose in life. Connecting their action plan to campus resources that are available to help them can be one particularly beneficial way of approaching this goal-setting process. And the final step is to help students identify and apply these talents and strengths to new situations or to the challenges they're facing. Reminding them that they have successfully dealt with challenges before can be encouraging, and even more so when we ask them to think about how they did that in the past. What strengths were they using then? What else helped them overcome their challenges? And then brainstorming with them about how they could use one of their talent themes to address a current problem they're facing can help them come up with a specific way of tackling that challenge. Remember, high achievers invent ways of doing this, so it's important not to skip this step with students. They need to come up with at least one thing they can do that would capitalize on a talent they have. By doing this, you are providing them with a reminder that they have the solution within them and that they have been successful before, which can energize and motivate them to tackle the current challenge. But the most important aspect of the strengths-based advising process is in the message we send to students. Rather than sending the message that there is one path to success, a strengths-based approach encourages students to become the best version of themselves in order to succeed in academics and in life. Jane, back to you.
Thank you so much, Laurie. Next up is Jeff McClellan, who will discuss the advising as coaching approach. Jeff is an assistant professor of management and an academic advisor at Frostburg State University, and his presentation on advising as coaching at the 2009 NACADA Annual Conference in San Antonio received outstanding reviews. We'd also like to acknowledge that Pat Kriska, who was the chair of the NACADA Advising and Academic Coaching Interest Group, helped Jeff in preparing today's broadcast, but due to illness, Pat is not able to be with us today. So, Jeff.
Thank you, Jane, Laurie, and salutations from the balmy Appalachian highlands of Frostburg. First, let me express my appreciation to those who have preceded me in the webinar. Their insights have been very informational and have given me a lot to think about and a lot of tremendous insights for practice. Hopefully I can follow in their footsteps well. I also want to thank Pat Kriska, whose words and ideas I'm privileged to join with my own in this presentation. Having said that, let me turn my attention now to the concept of advising as coaching. Academic coaching as a component of the advising function is rising in prominence. Numerous sessions at the last NACADA Annual Conference dealt with the topic, and the Advising and Academic Coaching Interest Group has formed over the past 2 years. While some schools offer an optional coaching program to every student, the application of this advising approach appears to self-sort into 3 general categories. First, a focus on retention. Second, a focus on assistance for students at risk. And third, a focus on bridging the gap from college life to the world of work. As a concept, however, advising as coaching is grounded in the practice of leadership or executive coaching, which has emerged as a professional field from within the fertile soil of multiple disciplines. Although its actual lineage as an idea and as a practice is difficult to trace, it appears to have emerged around the early 80s. It has been argued that it represents an interdisciplinary approach to facilitating personal growth and decision-making that is grounded in the study of developmental, humanist, and existential psychology, as well as adult education theory, management and leadership theory, and athletic training. The practice itself, however, appears to have emerged from the use of professional psychological counselors in the workforce and adult education programs in the post-World War II era, with its most immediate practical emergence rooted in the work of a rather unconventional tennis coach named Galway, who translated his facilitated approach to coaching to the workplace. It was his approach and ideas, which he taught to others, that led to the earliest formal coach training programs and many of the early books on coaching. At present, the field of coaching has emerged rapidly, and the theory has been striving to catch up. Consequently, coaching remains a somewhat ill-defined concept, with each different coach and different schools of practice employing different approaches, tools, and techniques, and each informed by their own experience and theoretical background. Nonetheless, there does appear to be some consensus about what coaching is in a procedural sense. My own review of the literature has led me to construct a three-level model of coaching that encompasses what is perhaps a potentially acceptable way of looking at the processes that accompany different approaches to coaching. These three levels include, first, a macro-level perspective, which focuses on the overall long-term development of the client throughout the entire span of the coaching relationship. The second level is a session-based perspective on coaching that focuses on how coaching is carried out in an individual session with a client from beginning to end. The third is a micro-level perspective on how coaching is used to facilitate client decision-making that can occur within any given coaching session. When looking at coaching from the macro perspective, we see that the first stage of the coaching process begins with the initiation of contact between the coach and the client. This is followed by relationship building and then assessment and inquiry. In this third stage, coaches collect information about the client via formal assessment and/or interviews with the client and significant others. This provides the coach and client with the information necessary to establish goals and to agree upon the terms for proceeding. The coach then assists the client in developing an action plan, implementing the plan, and following through on the plan to achieve the desired results. Periodically, assessment is conducted anew to assess progress and refine the plan. This macro-level stage occurs over time, and individual sessions may focus entirely on just one of these steps or even one small piece of these steps, depending on the needs of the client. The session-based perspective examines how coaches proceed through individual sessions. At this level, the coach begins with preparation for the session based on previous work accomplished and any preset conditions for the current meeting. This is followed by an initial greeting that sets the stage for personal interaction and rapport building. It is worth noting, however, that rapport building, while typically acting as a defined stage in early elements of the process, often fades into the process over time as the relationship becomes more well established. The coach then inquires as to the needs or progress of the client and engages in the act of coaching him or her. Following this, they review progress and goals for the next session and close the session. The client is then left to follow up on any agreements made before preparing to the next session, as does the coach. This level, of course, introduces us to the final level of coaching, which we may refer to as the act of coaching itself. The act of coaching, or the micro-level process of facilitating decision-making processes for the client, depending on the approach, this process may be more directive or facilitated. And it is at this level that the greatest amount of variance in coaching approaches occurs. Nonetheless, the following stages appear to be consistent across the multiple models of coaching. As indicated in the session-level perspective, the process begins with active listening and inquiry as to the dreams or challenges the individual is dealing with. The coach then examines the current reality of the client and proceeds to brainstorm with him or her a list of potential solutions. Once this brainstorming process is complete, clients are asked and assisted in selecting from among these options those which are most viable and constructing them into an action plan. The coach then guides the client with regard to identifying appropriate support in the form of both people or resources for achieving the plan and encourages implementation and schedules follow-up. If these three levels seem familiar to you, it is probably because many of the approaches my colleagues have discussed today are very similar to those I have outlined here, as is the actual advising process. In reality, many of the approaches that we've discussed today have been utilized by professional coaches in many different situations. For schools wishing to implement elements of coaching into their advising program, I suggest first determining the level at which you choose to do so. Do you wish to incorporate the more development-oriented, assessment-based, ongoing macro-level coaching processes into your advising program? Or do you want to incorporate the session-level techniques and approaches into your training and the practice of advisors? Or is it the micro-level facilitation skills and approaches that you want advisors to demonstrate in working with students? Once this decision is made, you can then effectively implement coaching processes and procedures into your work. Many of the programs that incorporate coaching into their work do so at all of these levels. I'd like to share a little bit of information about just two of these programs. The first is the Cox School of Business at Southern Methodist University in Dallas, Texas, which has a mentoring program called Business Associates Program. Through this program, students are matched with accomplished business professionals in the city who coach the students through the process of career strategy, internship search, and the post-grad job search. In the Cox School of Business, second semester sophomores complete an online application listing their majors, career inclinations, and other interests, and they are matched with experienced business professionals in that field. Results have seen a large increase in students acquiring meaningful internships and full-time jobs after graduation. Approximately 10% of eligible students participate. In order to facilitate the meeting process, the school hosts several events and activities for the students and their mentors each semester. Students are also provided with several opportunities to meet mentors other than the one with whom they are matched. In addition to these scheduled events, students and mentors are also encouraged to meet at least once a month. These meetings frequently occur at campus-adjacent coffee houses or eateries, but mentors are also encouraged to invite students to visit their workplace or attend community functions in which the mentor participates. This program is managed through the BBA Advising and Records Office, and Pat Kriska, who we have already mentioned, is the chair of the NACADA Advising and Academic Coaching Interest Group, and is our contact person at SMU. Utah Valley University also implemented advising as coaching as a part of their award-winning advisor training program. It was used as a way of training advisors in the micro-level skills and individual session skills that are necessary to be effective in this model. Clint Moser, the Director of Advisor Training and Development, is our contact person at Utah Valley, and he'd be happy to answer any questions you might have about their program. Having assisted in the development of that program, I would be more than happy to provide additional information if needed. No doubt, as you've listened to this presentation, you've noticed the similarity between what you already do in advising and the coaching process. Coaching is, as I said before, a natural way of approaching the art and practice of academic advising. Furthermore, the practices and literature of coaching have much to offer towards improving the practice and training of academic advisors. I appreciate the opportunity to share this information with you. Back to you, Jane.
Well, thank you, Jeff. Our final panelist today is Scott Amundson, who will discuss the Appreciative Advising Approach. Scott is the Associate Dean for Curricular Programs and FYE at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington, and he serves in the NACADA membership as chair of the Appreciative Advising Interest Group. He's presented on this topic in a number of different venues.
Thank you. Appreciative advising incorporates many of the strengths and techniques that the panelists have discussed today. It's definitely a strength-based approach with a focus on motivation and often occurs in an intrusive advising format. Appreciative advising can be broken down into steps, but what I would argue and what I want to focus on today is the mindset. Let me briefly explain how appreciative advising came to be. Let's take a look at the developmental timeline. Appreciative advising draws upon the work of David Cooper Ryder at Case Western Reserve. A great deal of information is available on the stages and applications of appreciative inquiry, which is what was developed at Case Western, at the Appreciative Inquiry Commons. The appreciative inquiry stages are the 4D and 5D approach, and those have been adapted in the appreciative advising techniques. Jenny Bloom and Nancy Archer Martin first wrote about applying the AI approach to academic advising in 2002 in an article in The Mentor. In 2003, the term appreciative advising was coined at UNC Greensboro during a probation program that used a lot of these approaches, including some of the other ones that you've heard today. The program really followed an intrusive format and was recognized with national awards by both NACADA and Noel Levitz in 2005. A brief overview of that program can be found in the Academic Advising Handbook, the newest edition. The NACADA Appreciative Advising Interest Group was formed in 2005. This interest group gives us a platform to share our ideas, encourage research, and visit with others about new programs that can be put into place. Now, the appreciative approach or the deficit-based approach. Which road will you take? When talking with advisors or conducting trainings, most folks say, I'll take the high road. I'm positive. And that is the method that most people think they're using. But sometimes we find that our message as advisors is confused or not heard correctly by our advisees, and they're hearing a deficit-based approach, which focuses on their weaknesses or current problems rather than the solutions approach. Many times an advisee's first visit with an advisor or first visit to an advising office is due to a problem or a stress. Sometimes this is the first academic problem they've had in a long time, and they may be really embarrassed, concerned about this particular academic issue. Building off appreciative inquiry, appreciative advising focuses on the power of the positive questions. Advisors ask intentionally positive questions to force students to focus on past peak performances and/or positive imagery. This is both an intentional and intrusive approach. Along with the power of the positive question, it is critical that advisors ask the right questions right out of the gate. One of the tenets of appreciative inquiry that definitely carries over into appreciative advising is the first question is fateful. The way you lead off when you first meet a student, the first question you ask is going to set the tone. Advisees will frequently determine whether they see value in visiting with their advisor by the first questions that is asked. This sounds easy, but it does take some work. Let's look at a practical example. This example is adapted from a study in a book called How Full Is Your Bucket? You heard about Donald Clifton earlier. He's one of the authors of this book, along with Thomas Rath. These guys were pioneers in the strengths movement. In a worldwide study conducted by Gibb, parents, when presented with these grades, across the board, immediately focused on the F in math. Now, as an advisor, when you see these grades, most of us would be drawn to that F and might start asking questions about that first. Again, this could be your first meeting with this student, first time you've ever met, and they may be embarrassed about this grade. Now, appreciative advising is not about sugarcoating or not talking about the grade in math, but we want to lead a different way. We would lead by talking about the grades in English, history, and biology, and having the students explain the methods that they were successful in that class. What was it about the teacher that encouraged them? What was it about the class that they found particularly interesting? Oftentimes, the student's story will also bring out strengths and passions in those areas that will be helpful for them as far as making decisions about coursework in the future. If you start with the good grades, by the time you do get to the math, most of the times the student has already answered the question about what the struggle was there. Again, if you start with the math grade, students might vote with their feet and never return. You certainly won't be the first person they go to next time a problem arises. Positive conversations are intentional. There are no neutral conversations. Oftentimes we think we have a neutral question, but if you think it's neutral, it's probably negative. We look at the bucket analogy again. You're either filling or dipping when you ask a question. There's no neutral. Here's an example for you parents out there. I have an 11-year-old son named Zane. If I ask Zane the neutral-sounding question, What did you do in school today, Zane? There's only one answer to the question. Nothing. Now, by just simply changing the question, an intervention takes place. Zane, what was the best thing that happened at school today? Zane, what was the funniest thing that happened in school today? The intervention is there, and you'll get a much different answer. It was kind of the same question. Simple concept, but you do have to work on it to make it happen intentionally. Now, I've talked about philosophy and wanted to take a minute just to talk about some practical tools. You've heard about some others today that are wonderful, and these are the ones that primarily are used with the Appreciative approach. A consortium of advisors who are into this Appreciative advising developed an instrument called the AAI, the Appreciative Advising Inventory. The inventory helps both students and advisors better understand the personal assets that students with them to college, both internal and external resources. Now, the Appreciative inventory is a little different than most in that the boxes that the students tick, the questions that are asked first are about the areas that the students already have expertise or already are excelling in. We want to drive home the point that they have a lot of positive things in place. We want to hear the stories about their family support, their preparation that they feel good about. By starting there, again, the student gets comfortable and gets to tell you stories that they often don't get asked about. I've also used the Appreciative Advising Inventory to allow students to choose an area that they may not possess, but want to. And again, you can use scaling and some of the other techniques that you heard about there. There's also another strengths survey out there. It's the VIA, Survey of Character Strengths, and that's available through Martin Seligman's Positive Psychology Center at the University of Pennsylvania. Again, great starting point, just a good discussion started about what students do possess and how they can use those character attributes. Now, Appreciative Advising, and I think a lot of the philosophies that you've heard about today, people have talked about working with at-risk student populations or probation students. And Appreciative Advising definitely got started working with that population, and it's still currently going. I know at UNC Greensboro, UNC Wilmington, University of South Carolina, IUPUI, I know have all worked with probation students using this approach, and that there's some others as well. But I would encourage folks out there to use Appreciative Advising in other ways. And there's a chart in your handout that shows how other schools have incorporated Appreciative Advising or these techniques, both to work with probation students, but also in advisor trainings, working with adult learners, implementing this type of philosophy in your FYE programs. Lots of different applications out there for Appreciative Advising. It does work really well with probation students, but it's definitely not the only approach. And one of the things we'd like to say is, wow, if it works this well with probation students, imagine how well it would work with honor students. So thank you again, and I'll turn it back over to Jayne.
Actually, I'll turn it over to Maura for a few wrap-up comments. Thanks, Scott. The panelists have given us a lot to think about. Now what? How do we respond? The idea isn't necessarily to choose one approach to the exclusion of the others. Instead, let's acknowledge that there are many ways to improve learning as we advise, and today we've heard about 6 approaches. Were your reactions like mine? As I listened to our panelists, I found parts of every approach I know I'll adapt to my own advising. And the more tools and approaches I have in my advising toolbox, the more I'll be able to meet the needs of the diverse students I work with. I hope this was true for you as well. And now it's time for questions. Lee?
All right, looks like we have about 15 minutes or so left that we can use for panel discussion. So Jayne, I'm going to turn it back over to you, and let's do some Q&A.
You got it, Lee. Thank you. I see a number of questions coming in already. Thank you for that. There are a number of questions on what would be the better approach given this circumstance or that circumstance. So let me just acknowledge here that I believe what our panelists are saying today, even though they're providing you their particular angle of vision on these advising approaches, is that there's no one approach that's better than any other. Some may work better than others in certain situations, and we're certainly not trying to include one to the exclusion of the others. And so, having said that, let me see if I can capture some questions here. And let me begin with Carrie Kincannon. You talked about advising for self-authorship. We have a question here. It says, it sounds as if this self-authorship approach would be time-consuming. So the question is, how do you put this theory into practice in an environment with high advisor-advisee ratios and a limited capacity to meet demand? Could you tackle that one for us, Carrie?
I will sure try. I'm hoping that my microphone's working a little better now and the tech difficulties are resolved. So appreciate your patience with that. I'm very sympathetic to this question. I have advising ratios in my program about 300 to 1, and I know folks on my campus often have advising ratios that are higher than that. And we're on a quarter system. I'm trying to meet with my students every term, and that's pretty tough. At best, I'm getting about 30 minutes with them. And quite frankly, the learning partnership model and self-authorship, if it's fully realized, it's very layered, very, very high contact. So ideally, you need to create more time and space for that, but realistically, that's going to be pretty tough. I'm gonna harken back to something that Jeffrey said in his presentation about levels of coaching implementation. I think that applies here too. I think you can pick and choose elements of this theory that you bring in even the most resource-starved environments that are going to be really effective. One of them is questioning. I mean, that's the centerpiece of advising for self-authorship is asking. My colleague says somebody just has to ask why. Why? Okay, so you're thinking about majoring in nursing or history, but why? And sort of probing there. The other piece that I think works really well is that this is the learning partnership model. This is a partnership, and you need to be in a position to draw upon other resources on your campus. I'm pretty fortunate enough to be part of an academic success center that has a peer-led academic coaching program, and they very often have more time than I do to spend with students. So if I'm working with a student on probation or warning, I will often refer them on to the peer coaching program, and we work together to realize success.
Thank you, Carrie. And I'd like to, if I may, just follow up on this self-authorship approach that both you and Janet have outlined. And this, maybe I can give this one to Janet. How can one reconcile provoking disequilibrium in students with the other approaches, such as appreciative advising or even strength-based advising? Janet, can you tackle that one?
Sure, I'd be happy to. I think, like Carrie said, the learning partnership model is really actually very consistent with elements of the other approaches that we discussed today. So what is different about self-authorship is the prominence it places on helping students recognize the things that aren't working and the productive aspect of being uncomfortable. So that discomfort is really necessary to provoke student growth. But I think the advisor can simultaneously challenge students to recognize and grapple with those issues, like helping them to recognize a disconnect between their interests and their abilities, while also supporting them through that challenge. A particular technique one would use, and I think you could use techniques from any of these perspectives discussed today, would really depend on the existing relationship between the advisor and the student. So in that example I used today of the student who was struggling with science, that was the first time I ever interacted with a student. So in order to help him see that disconnect that he had, I used appreciative techniques to come to that part of the conversation. With a student in a similar situation who I have a longer-term relationship, I was a little bit more direct with him in pointing out those discrepancies. So I don't think that they're really at odds with each other at all.
Okay, very good. I am going to turn to Jennifer Varney, if I may, and your discussion of the intrusive advising approach. And I have several questions here from our audience. One is, could you please expand on why intrusive advising works well with at-risk students? And then the second question is, someone wondering if you could tell us more about how you manage advising in hallways and in break rooms, and your concerns that you would have, of course, for FERPA and any privacy issues. There's a couple questions embedded there.
Okay, no problem. The first one, I think that intrusive advising kind of is a part of all of the approaches that were discussed today. It seems to be foundational to all of them. And I think to answer the question about why it works so well with at-risk student kind of goes back to the learning principles that Maura mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. As I look back over them, I think about one of them was about active learning being more effective than passive. And I think intrusive advising helps students to become more active learners because it brings things to light that they may not have thought about before, and advisors can encourage them to self-advocate more through being intrusive. I think that another principle Maura mentioned was about high expectations, encouraging high achievement, and as intrusive advisors, we absolutely would have high expectations for our students, and we have to communicate to them. Another principle that Maura mentioned was that motivation was alterable, and I think when we can make intentional contact with our students, reach out to them, let them know that we're here and we recognize their efforts, we know what they're doing, that can really help them to have an improved level of motivation. The principle Maura mentioned was about learning well. To learn well, advisees need feedback, and the intrusive advisor is sort of a master of feedback in that they're making intentional contact with students at points where feedback is really helpful in terms of grade postings or other kinds of things where students would really appreciate knowing that someone was paying attention to these things and someone was concerned about what the student was doing and willing to be there and cheerlead for them. And finally, the last one Maura had mentioned was interaction between advising and advisors is a powerful factor in promoting learning and really is the whole reason for intrusive advising is to have the intentional contact and the interaction between the students. So I think it kind of all circles together and does work particularly well with the at-risk students who typically don't know or may not know how to navigate the college system. So that's the answer to the first one. The second one about using intrusive advising in the hallways, what I used to do was keep a list of my students, and sometimes it did number in the hundreds, and that list was it was something I kept myself. Obviously, I didn't post anywhere. And as I saw students that I knew weren't registered, I just kind of would, go up to them and say, hey, how are you? Have you read for next term? What's happening? How are things going? Or if I happen to be, outside in the parking lot for whatever reason when a student pulled in, if they looked like maybe they weren't having a good day, I might say, hey, how you doing? You okay? Let's go in my office and talk if you want to. It was certainly never discussions of a private nature in a public place at all. It was more a matter of getting my face out there, letting the students know that I was there, I noticed them, that I knew who they were, and that I cared about them.
And boy, that's so important in the advising relationship we build with our students, for sure. So, well, thank you for that, Jennifer. Appreciate that. And I'm noticing a pattern to some of the questions a number of the questions that are coming in from our attendees. And it basically has to do with how do you do all of this when you have a lot of advisees and a little bit of time? So I'd like to turn next to Lori Schreiner. Two questions that build on each other, I think, in this area. The first question is, are all of the steps you outlined necessary for strengths-based advising to occur? And then the kind of subsidiary question to that is, how much time does it take to do strengths-based advising with students?
Okay, I will do my best to answer that question. Thank you for that. And I think it's always the question that arises with us is the time-consuming nature. And I would say to do advising well, it does take time. But most importantly, it's the way we're approaching our students. So regardless of which approach feels more comfortable to you, and I'm going to take a strengths-based approach even to the way advisors do their job, and that is you've got to be the best version of yourself as well. And so the style that fits with you, whether that's being intrusive, whether that's being motivational, seeing yourself as a coach, asking good questions is key to all of this. And whether you take concrete steps and kind of work through a strengths-based process, or whether it's a mindset and perspective, a lens through which you view your students, I think that's far more important than following particular steps. I simply outline steps in order to give people a concrete handle to say, well, this is what it means, or this is what it could look like. Here's what we're trying to accomplish. So I think we do have to make time for the students that we're working with, and but most importantly, we need to think about how the lens through which we're viewing our students and how we are having those conversations, and are we having them at the right time in a way that really taps into their motivation? Because I think that's the other key to all of this, is that good advising really taps into motivation in students, and that really becomes our biggest challenge and our biggest task, is how do we motivate them as they're facing some of the challenges in their life.
Thank you so much, Lori, and thank you to all of our presenters today. This has just been terrific. I know I join with all of those who are tuned in today to thank you for the good work you've done to bring this to us. So I'd like to turn this back over to Lee to wrap up. Lee?
Thank you all so much. Lots and lots of information. I think we could have all enjoyed going for another half hour or so if we didn't promise our folks that we would wrap up within that 90-minute time frame. So again, I want to thank you all for being with us today. I want to follow up with Jayne's remarks and thank our panelists for sharing their time and expertise with us. I also want to thank Jayne for taking the time to be our moderator today. Thanks to Gary for his work behind the scenes with the technology. On behalf of the association, thanks to each and every one of you. And thanks to all of our participants for being with us today. We look forward to interacting with you in future events and hearing your evaluation remarks about what you would like to see in future events. If you have any questions about this broadcast or those ahead of us, please be sure to visit the NACADA website or feel free to contact me directly. We look forward to seeing you again soon.